But we're very happy to be co-hosting this event. As people know, the New London Greens have dealt with the challenges that minor party or non-major party candidates have to deal with for a long time, since 2001. The battle is still going on, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion about it. So I'm going to introduce our four panelists, from closest to me to farthest from me. Maya Leonardo from Party of Socialism and Liberation, PSL. Fred Mitch Link from Socialist Action, who has been trying to run for U.S. Senate this year. Jeff Russell, Green Party candidate for U.S. Senate, who's actually been in the same boat as Mr. Link in the past, but actually does have ballot access this year after several tries to get through the system otherwise. And Peter Goslin, who is running on the Green Party ticket for Attorney General this year. So I am not sure what the format is, but I'm guessing the four have figured out.
We haven't, but why don't
you haven't? Maybe we can start with each of you making a short introduction.
Right, and then maybe do like questions and answers, or giving the audience more like diatribes and answers.
Awesome. So it's all yours.
Hi, I'm Maya Leonardo. I'm with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I come here to talk about what role running progressive independence has to play in building a popular movement for real, lasting change.
My name is Fred Link, running for the United States Senate under the Party Socialist Action. Here today to talk about the troubles with getting ballot access and why class independence is imperative moving forward in the electoral arena specifically.
My name's Jeff Russell. I'm the Green Party candidate for the United States Senate. I have been a write-in candidate. I have fought the battle to get ballot access more than once. I'd like to touch on the history of minor parties and third parties and how they have been valuable to the political landscape and have actually won elections and changed the paradigm in our history, which I think we are at a point that we need.
I'm Peter Goslin. I'm the Green Party candidate for Attorney General, and I'm finding, as I've been on the campaign trail for the last few months, that more and more of my presentations are extemporaneous. So that's going to be the case today. However, I do intend to touch on sort of what I would say is my vision of the role in Connecticut specifically of electoral work on the left.
You want to direct questions, Ron? I nominate Ron.
Oh my gosh.
Second.
Okay, I guess questions from the floor, and because I have no specific questions that I planned, do you have, I'll stack them if you all raise your hands at once. Adam.
Fred, I've been following your campaign for pretty much since its launch. I know that there have been concerted efforts in various parts of the state to intentionally lose ballot signatures that the petition went through and then was lost to follow-up. So I was just wondering if you could give like a brief synopsis of what happened once the appropriate number of signatures was collected.
Sure. So we started in February, and from February to August, we collected about 11,000 signatures from voters in Connecticut. We turned those in on August 8th to the Secretary of State. It was a total of 2,539 individual sheets, which was a lot. And the weeks went by, we weren't hearing anything, so we decided to call the Secretary of State, kind of see where we were in the process. They were vague, refused to give out, complete counts or how many petitions had been received. So on the 11th of September, we kind of held a press conference, after hearing some of the various flagrant illegal signature removals. So actually we found here. So in like a couple hours in the Secretary of State's office, being able to look through the petition sheets, we found 71 voters were ruled off by Hartford town clerks for being unaffiliated, which is actually not a legal reason to remove a voter from a petition. 25 voters were ruled off in New Haven for being inactive. Again, not a legal reason to reject a signature. 72 legible signatures were ruled off in New London for being illegible, but were easily read by our volunteers. And since then, we've been kind of going through photos and what we have of the petitions. So we found numerous signatures on Bridgeport petitions that were ruled off for being inactive. Again, not a legal reason to remove a signature. And we found a high percentage of signers marked as unregistered were in fact registered. For instance, a sample of 27 rejected signatures from Wethersfield, 12 show up on the voter rolls after a cursory search, or about 44%. Going through about half of the petition sheets we turned in, we found about 22% of the voters marked as unregistered were in fact registered. We could find them on the voter rolls relatively easily. And this basically comes down to the letter the Secretary of State sent out last Saturday to us saying that we did not achieve the correct number of validated signatures to be on the ballot. We were about 640 signatures short. We turned in more signatures than any other campaign in the state. And every other campaign easily made the threshold. We did not. Whether that's, we really think that we weren't given the due diligence and the dedication to validate our signatures that other more major parties have, or people who have large campaign coffers that could hire lawyers or have a bunch of volunteers go in and really scour it. This was an all-volunteer campaign. People gave up their weekends, their evenings after work for 6 months to really get these signatures. So we think it's a flagrant abuse of our democratic rights. And when it comes down to it, if you do the work, you get the signatures, you should be on the ballot. And we handed in almost 11,000. So.
Fred, can I just throw in? I just want to throw in one other thing about your campaign, and one of the things that I've been thinking about was that a lot of folks don't know is that in Connecticut, every community has registrars of voters, and there is a Democrat registrar of voters and a Republican registrar of voters, and so that means that literally the people who have been elected by political parties that may stand to lose votes to a write-in candidate or to a petitioning candidate are the ones who get to look at the signatures to determine whether or not they're valid. I think the first time that I had talked about the idea of this being, malfeasance and not just nonfeasance, it wasn't just that they were doing a bad job, they were deliberately doing a bad job. I was thinking of it in terms of, it sounds a little bit conspiratorial. But if you think about the fact that the people who are making these decisions are literally running for office alongside the people who Fred was challenging, that starts to actually make a lot more sense. It doesn't take a conspiracy. It simply takes political favoritism. And God knows the state of Connecticut's got plenty of that.
And if I could add, another thing that about the registrar of voters is that the Republicans and the Democrats aren't even elected to those positions. They get those positions whether they get 1 vote or 1 million. That's automatic. It's not an election, it's an appointment. But for us in other parties, we have to get a registrar of voters. We have to beat the vote total of the lower total of the 2 major party candidates who get in anyway. And I don't envy Fred because I've been a write-in candidate, and another act of either non-feasance or malfeasance. Connecticut statute says it's a felony to not count write-in votes, but nobody enforces that law. One of the years when I was a write-in Senate candidate, I believe it was 2012, the people responsible for counting votes in Waterbury, Connecticut, reported the number of votes for Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, which is a violation of Connecticut law. They reported 0 write-in votes. I'm sure I got write-in votes in Waterbury that year. None were counted. Again, that's a felony under Connecticut state law, and nobody enforces it. So, if they can't keep us off, when they succeed in keeping us off the ballot, they do other things to try and sweep us under the rug.
Fred, when you ran into these problems and noticed them with the Secretary of State, did you consider legal action or reach out to anyone for potential pro bono work? Because I will say that we had an issue 2 years ago here in New London with our registrar, who is terrible, and by the way, is not even elected. We're one of the few towns that directly the political town committees appoint the registrar. So it's even worse in New London. And we've had a lot of problems with him before. I actually sued him pro bono on behalf of a group of people that were trying to primary a DTC election here in New London, where, as you probably can guess, being a one-party city, it matters, who's on this little committee that basically handpicks your city council. We got it all the way to a hearing. We lost ultimately on that challenge, but I know there are a lot of lawyers. I don't want to, volunteer Peter, or myself or anyone. But did you ever consider legal action? Because you can take legal action to try to get these other signatures counted.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main issues here is that they delayed notifying us for so long. So technically, the town clerks have 2 weeks to return the petition ballots to the Secretary of State. We didn't hear for almost 7. So at this point, ballots have started to be printed.
It's too late.
It's too late. So the only thing we could do is file, and in the history of the United States, there's never been an injunction to stop ballot printing. So we looked into it, and we decided that we think it makes more sense to just do these kind of speaking tours, get out there and talk, and the point of the campaign more than anything else, as a socialist, is to clarify the class nature of the state. The state is not there for the working class, it's there for the ruling class, the capitalist class. And no amount of political jockeying within that framework necessarily is going to change the class nature of the state. And that's one of the main clarifying points of the campaign.
Are you still going to register as a certified write-in?
Absolutely, yes.
So I came in late, so I didn't hear, so your campaign is effectively over, is that true?
We're still going to do a write-in campaign.
Okay, but
We will
Denise
not have
Merrill,
ballot access, yeah.
and when did she decide this? When did she?
We got the letter last Saturday, so a week ago, basically.
So I spoke to her last Saturday
Mhm.
at an event,
Mhm.
and I asked her about what was happening,
Mhm.
and she said that in fact Hartford had not counted any of the unaffiliated signatures.
Interesting.
Yeah, and she said that she was, that this was the first time ever that her office was immediately and directly involved with rectifying that.
Interesting.
And I
Okay.
said, well, that's really important, and I can imagine that
Mhm.
the other, I think maybe there were 25 other towns that you got signatures from.
Yes.
I said I would think that it would be equally important to, to work closely as you are with Hartford in getting making sure these signatures are counted. So talking to her on last Saturday, she seemed to say, everything is, we're on top of this and we understand your concern and yes, I'm doing my job.
That's interesting because I got the official letter that day, that morning from the post, from the United States Postal Service saying you have not cleared the threshold for ballot access. So that's interesting.
Think about that when you're voting for Secretary of State.
Wow.
Adam, you have your hand.
I was just curious about, especially Fred, Peter, and I'm sorry, I forgot your name? Jeff, sorry. I was curious about your thoughts about how your campaigns, both or either or individually or collectively, could translate the energy and momentum of the campaign into a street movement moving forward. Because obviously, regardless of what the outcome is, elections end, and then we'll be in between election cycles until it pops up again. So I was curious about what your thoughts might be about that.
I've been an activist, an environmental activist, a peace activist since the mid-1960s. My activism will continue. I have not had a campaign that had a lot of energy in it to translate to that, but I have made contacts that that I have been able to encourage into greater activism. And I'll continue to do that. If somebody else has some good ideas about getting that ball rolling a little faster, getting a little bigger, I'm going to jump in with both feet. We are in a point in history where minority voices are squelched at every turn. People don't understand that in 1852, there was no Republican candidate for president because there was no Republican Party. And all this crap about, third parties can never win. Well, in 1852, the sitting president, Millard Fillmore, was a Whig. If third parties can never win, if minor parties can never win, where's the Whig candidate today? And the Republicans were a third party, a minor party in 1854, and they won federal elections in the 1854 election cycle. But third parties can't win. They elected a president 6 years later. A 6-year-old third party, minor party, elected a president in 1860. But third parties can never win. We're fighting a bigoted press that wants to cover elections like they are horse races, and they never talk about the issues. I want this man's name on the ballot because I want him to be part of the conversation. I want to hear what he has to say. I am confident if I listen to Fred, Mitch, Link, I will learn something. It will enable me to make a better contribution to the society, to the improvement of the society we live in. This is where our society is getting really in trouble because we are not allowed at the table. We are not allowed to participate. And the ideas and solutions that we bring are being ignored. And if we don't stop that, we are going to drive over the cliff.
Oh, and then, but after.
Oh, yeah. And to that question about a campaign being also transferring over into a street action, I would say Fred's campaign is a great example of where it's both, because you were out in the street meeting thousands of people, whether they were Republican and they just wanted to whatever, or they were Democrat, or they were on your side fully. They got the message, and you were out there meeting people, and they were hearing what you were talking about. I've done it at a small scale and a municipal election, but I would say that's a great place where the campaign hits the pavement of interacting with people. But obviously, there's other things too. And I try not to be. I understand that some people believe just in socialist revolution, and I do too, but not to be too inflexible about I'm only going to do this what my small club wants, but recognize that if we get together, that's how you build a movement. And so interacting with people, including your mother, your cousins, your friends, the people in the street, is so important because you're reaching out beyond that level of where your beliefs lie to meeting people where they are. So I commend that, and I think that's a great example.
So yeah, to your point, I think it's important to know and to understand that power for working people and oppressed people doesn't come from the legislative halls of Washington, D.C. It comes from those people being organized in their neighborhoods, at their jobs, on their campuses, and in their communities. That's where the power comes from. And that's the only sort of power the working class really has, is the ability to come together and shut down production. So like Owen was saying, during the petitioning drive, we went and talked to about 1 out of every 100 adults in Connecticut to get those 11,000 signatures. And we met people all across the political spectrum, and we got a campaign card in their hand that had socialist demands on it. things like reparations for Puerto Rico, African Americans, and indigenous communities, jail killer cops, full 100% transition to renewable power, defending unions and workers' rights to organize and unionize, dismantling the U.S. war machine and the 800 and change bases we have around the planet. And that's part of a socialist campaign, is not so much to take office in some legislative hall where the working class has no power. It's to raise the consciousness of the working class, to make people understand who the enemy is, who the enemy is not. The enemy is the small handful of billionaires that make all the decisions about how the surplus that we create is spent, whether that's through the military-industrial complex or more pollution or more oppression for nations around this world or people here in this country. Socialist campaigns need to point out that our oppression is linked. And that's not to put some crude class category on oppression, but to point out how the multi-headed hydra of capitalism oppresses everyone, how those oppressions are linked, and how if solidarity becomes our slogan, we can overturn the social order that enforces them and requires them to exist and propagate.
And can I hire you as a speechwriter? I agree with everything that Fred just said, and I've campaigned on it. And one of the things that I got out of a petitioning drive is I always went with other people, because being the candidate, I could stand aside while they were collecting signatures and talk issues. And that's where I got people saying, I wasn't going to vote at all, but after talking to you, I'm voting. That shows you how disenfranchised and dissatisfied people are with the system. And, from a pragmatic political standpoint, if I thought the way the Republicans and the Democrats did, it would be a cold day in hell that I'd sit up at a table advocating for Fred Link's access to the ballot line, because our positions are so similar that we'd split a vote and it would endanger us of losing the ballot lines. And that's one of the travesties of the system here in Connecticut. It's incredibly difficult to get on the ballot line, even without the stacked deck and the shenanigans that you face. And it's incredibly easy to get off of it. We have lost the ballot line and regained it for President of the United States and United States Senate. We have lost the ballot for United States House of Representatives in the Fairfield County District. It's that 3rd Congressional District before, I don't remember the numbers anymore. We have, lost ballot lines, all over the place and had to fight to get them back. And, it constantly puts us at a disadvantage, but that's what the system is trying to do, put us at a disadvantage. There wasn't anything unreasonable about what Fred just said in his list of issues. You think you're going to see any of those issues discussed on the Hartford Courant front page?
No.
I won't hold my breath. I mean, I've been ignored saying very similar things. A lot of other candidates have been ignored just because, we weren't on the Republican or Democrat line. But these are good ideas. This is speaking truth to power. And well done, brother. Keep it up.
I had a couple of comments that I wanted to make as well, but I also know that the way the original question was framed, it was directed towards the candidates. And although the PSL is not running anyone, I know that Maya came prepared to talk about this issue, which really is an issue that affects, it's an important question for the left in general. That's one of the reasons we organized this. So if I may cede my time to the delegate from New Haven.
Thanks, Peter. I think independent runs have a lot of utility as translating like mass movement. The PSL has experience with this in the work we've done trying to raise awareness of and promote Peter's campaign in New Haven and elsewhere. Where electoral work and mass work are two heads of the same hydra, and they are. We need to recognize that electoral power is nothing without people power, and getting people in the streets to really advocate for change can advocate for change that, sometimes reforms are necessary, sometimes a movement for reforms is the solution to an immediate issue. Other times, it's a movement for revolution that is appropriate.
Bud, you
I thank you all for all the work that you do. And yeah, we really need to quit fighting among ourselves. We need to work together because we do have a common enemy. The enemy is out there. It's not in here, and I'm saying that for not necessarily to you, but to the Green Party, which I think is probably going to be resolved fairly shortly, one way or the other.
Getting along is always an ongoing process. And the left has a tradition of being kind of fragmented. I tell people that in maybe 2003, I went to a big demonstration in New York City and talked to like 4 socialists and ended up with 4 different socialist newspapers. It's all of us tend to get stuck in our little silos, and we end up with the same kind of effect as what Jeff was talking about in terms of splitting vote and losing ballot access. We lose power to forward momentum in many different ways when we can't put aside pettiness and work on common goals.
And I also want to thank Jeff for his kind words for Fred, because I agree that, the issues, I think pretty much I can speak for everybody here that
The fragmentation always reminds me of the scene in the Monty Python movie Life of Brian, where they're all in the amphitheater. And, he's the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. Nobody talks to him. And, they're the FFPLP, and there's the PPLL, and there's all these groups of 1 or 2 or 3 people, and like I said, there's a lot of similarities. We have a lot of common ground, and I just saw a study. I forget which university put it out, but we really live in an oligarchy. The legislatures, national and state, and the executives don't pay any attention to us, to we the people. But the 1%, they make a phone call, and it's just a matter of time before they get what they want. Especially with the Congress and the president we have now. But both major parties are guilty of this. Both major parties are in their pockets. Both major parties get their major funding from them. And those of us who don't, either fund our campaigns out of our own pockets and end up running on shoestrings, but we can take that power back. But we've got to stop the linear thinking. We've got to do the lateral thinking. Third parties can win. Our history proves that. And as Ralph Nader pointed out, there isn't a single social movement in this country that made a real change that was not affiliated in some way, shape, or form with a third party movement. Third party politics has a very powerful and very valuable function in our history. And we need to respect that and do a lot more with it.
Jeff, when you talk about breaking away from lateral thinking, which I agree. One of the things that makes me think about, and this was a really big factor for me in making the decision to run in this campaign this year. Frankly, I was invited by folks from the Green Party because of my legal background and because I'd acquired, I think, something of a reputation as a social justice lawyer, to run for Attorney General. And they made it clear to me, look, you know what, if you even only have enough time to run to keep the ballot status, that's great. That's a plus for us. But obviously I wanted to be able to do a lot more than that. But from my perspective, when I thought about that issue, one of the first things that I thought about was this problem, which I've observed as an activist in Connecticut over many, many years. We see it outside of the electoral arena. We definitely see it inside. But in the movement as a whole, is that as small as Connecticut is, it's an extremely balkanized community. And so, and in some respects, it's balkanized along the lines that are quite familiar to us. Of course, there are the problems of, a state that has a tremendous range of rich and poor communities, as well as, suburban so-called middle-class communities in between. Of course, it's balkanized between Black and white and Latino, as so much of the country is. But even in terms of the social movements, I've lived in the Hartford area for about the last 40 years, and the number of times that I've seen at moments of political upheaval, the number of times that I have seen people get together in Connecticut and say, we need to build a statewide coalition. And then 2 weeks later, we have a statewide coalition that's based in New Haven and another one that's based in Hartford. And it reflects, the extent to which we have not developed organizations and relationships, and which maybe in this context is even more important, relationships that span the entire state. As doing the kind of legal work that I did, participating in both, as part of my law practice and also doing work with the National Lawyers Guild and being a legal observer and helping people deal with First Amendment issues, I got a chance to meet with people in a lot of very, very different communities in Connecticut. Ranging from the folks who are dealing with like the upfront issue of police brutality and young people being afraid to leave their homes because a cop might shoot them dead, up to the folks who are calling me up and saying, we've been told by the police that we can't go down to our town green and hold signs that say that we want peace and not war. So folks are experiencing this system and the oppression that it offers across an extremely wide range of circumstances. But I think it's also the case in recent years that the left and the progressive movement in general in Connecticut has been more in touch with each other than it ever has been. And again, I base this over a long period of time. I certainly can remember the times when left political parties actually were taking on issues where one organization has this issue and another organization has this other issue, and they're literally acting as if they are in an antagonistic relationship to each other. And that's clearly not the case on the left now. This is a really, really good moment. And I think it's a reflection of the greater maturity of the left. I think it's a reflection of the shift of folks out of the Democratic Party as a result of the Sanders campaign. I think that the Jill Stein campaign had a lot to do with it. I think Black Lives Matter had a lot to do with it. I think Occupy had a lot to do with it. They've touched a lot of different communities in a lot of different ways. So I see us as being poised at a particular historical moment where there's an opportunity to develop these relationships, which, like I said, might very much be relationships between people and organizations rather than in the same organization, in order to collaborate in a lot of areas. But electoral politics is potentially one of them. And I think one of the things we wanted to demonstrate here was that, we have a group of some folks here from different political perspectives who are able to sit down and say, yeah, we are on the same page when it comes to this struggle. And we want to work together. We want to find as many ways to work together as possible. We have political differences, and that's perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We're going to have different perspectives on some logistical and strategic issues. That's perfectly okay too. But there is an opportunity now, and I think it has been created for us here in Connecticut in a very particular form because we're a small state. Now, if I was going to make a criticism, after having said all these nice things, if I was going to make a criticism of the left in Connecticut, one of the things that I would point out is that to a large extent, we have built organizations that sometimes are quite influential around whatever the issue is we're working on, or sometimes even as parties. We've built organizations and coalitions in particular parts of the state, and sometimes to the extent of having a significant influence in local politics. I know that's the case here in New London. For folks who don't know, the Green Party's candidate is the chair of the Board of Ed and has sat on the Board of Ed for what, 3 terms now?
Yeah.
President of the board.
Yeah, President.
President of the board, sorry.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that's a significant accomplishment. But what struck me in this last year was that in the midst of ferocious arguments between not only between, but between and among the 2 major parties about the state budget and what was going to happen to taxes and were there going to be tolls, was the sales tax going to go up, were they going to cut funding for this program or that program, that in the midst of that debate, to a large extent, the left was absent. I mean, really, in any kind of a serious way. Yes, in our own corners of the world, we talked to people about those issues and we said why these things are bad. But, you know, I had a discussion with someone who I considered, you know, a very good progressive, you know, something of a comrade about the issue of tolls. And I said to her, you know, we can't talk to people about whether tolls should be used instead of something else unless the something else is taxes on rich people. Because otherwise, we're just playing their game. And her response was, well, yeah, but you know what? The reality is we're either going to get tolls or we're going to get something else, and we're not going to get taxes on rich people. Like, yeah, one of the reasons for it, in addition to all the limitations that are put on us by the system itself, but one of the reasons for that is that we have done a really terrible job of organizing political power at the local level in order to influence what happens in Hartford. Now, if we were in the state of California, I'd say we had a pretty good excuse for that, because California is a huge state. If we were in Alaska or Texas, sure, that makes sense. But we're in Connecticut. It's one of the smallest states in the country. And we happen to live in a state which is divided into 169 little tiny towns. Although we have counties, technically, they mean, in terms of political power, they mean absolutely nothing. So essentially, we have these little fiefdoms for various little, you know, political crowned heads, and then we have this what happens at the State House, and the left has had virtually no influence on what happens at the State House, and I think that you know, one of the things from my point of view, thinking about the issue of the future of the left and electoral politics in Connecticut, and again, I'm talking specifically about what I think is relevant to Connecticut, is that we need to be able to make serious inroads in both running candidates and potentially even electing people to positions at the state legislature, in the state house and in the state senate, not because that's going to give us the power to control what happens there. It would be absurd to believe that was true. Not even so much to be able to say, here's our program, and somehow convince the liberal Democrats to follow it, because I don't believe that's going to happen either. But the reason to do it would be to have people on the inside who can expose what's happening there, who can expose the fact that every single day the Democrats and Republicans in the legislature, no matter what they tell you in your community, no matter what the guy who lives down the street who's your state rep, no matter what he tells you, no matter what the woman who is the head of the local women's organization, who's also in the state senate, no matter what they tell you, they are selling us out every single day. They're making deals based on what's what's in the interest of the wealthiest people and the biggest corporations. And when it comes to working people, when it comes to the small businesses in our community, they have no concern for us whatsoever. They are glad to squeeze every drop of blood they can, and they will not stop until we expose that for what it is and show that we're capable of fighting back against it. And I think that the reason for adopting an approach that says, let's actually run people in a strategic way across various left organizations, but through a vehicle like the Green Party, because the Green Party has done the work. They've done the heavy lifting. That's gotten ballot status in a lot of places and has minor party status and some degree of name recognition. But the reason to do that is so that we can turn up the heat in a really significant way at the state capitol, so that these politicians have some sense that somebody is holding them accountable. When they have these asinine votes on budgets, somebody might have seen, hopefully somebody saw this, I posted the other day. Essentially, we have like 3 stripes of elected officials in the state capitol right now, with respect to the issue of state employees and the state pensions and all the hoo-ha that goes on around that. As a former state employee, it's something I feel rather strongly about. I know what it's like to be providing a vital service, and yet your job is in jeopardy because some politician in Hartford has decided that you are a good political target.
Or the government tells you to do something because something happened. You got to do something. You
got to do something. Right, exactly. You got to do something. So essentially, we have 3 stripes of politicians in Hartford right now. We have Republicans who attack state workers and admit that they're attacking state workers. We have the Malloy Democrats who are getting the endorsements of the state workers' unions and then attacking state workers. And then we have the Progressive Democrats who are promising not to attack state workers, getting the endorsements of state workers' unions, and then attacking the state worker unions anyway, because what other choice do we have? It's capitalism, you have to have austerity, this is just the way it works. And until we have an independent voice in Hartford that is capable of exposing this on a day-by-day basis, we are not going to be able to mobilize people the way that we need to solve some of these really pressing problems. The cities in Connecticut and the poor rural communities in Connecticut cannot find their way out of these problems by themselves. They are structurally incapable of doing so. When you have a city like Bridgeport, or New London for that matter, with a relatively small tax base that's not going to get any bigger, with school systems that are facing problems having to do with high levels of poverty, child malnutrition, homelessness, all the things that urban schools have to deal with at one level or another. There isn't a funding system that these politicians in New London or Bridgeport or Hartford or anywhere else, there's no funding system that they're going to be able to come up with. They're going to make a deal with the folks in Hartford and say, oh yeah, now we're going to make sure that your kids get the same education as our kids. The reason the system is set up the way it is, the reason it's 169 towns, is precisely so that some kids will have $30,000 a year spent on them for every school year, and other kids will have 10. So until we can bring that to light and fight on that territory, I don't think that we're going to be successful in terms of actually bringing forward to the fullest extent the class nature of the struggle that we're involved in here.
Yeah, 2 questions. I apologize for being late. One, I wanted to ask, what is your definition of revolution? What does that entail? I'm very much nonviolence. However, I'll tell you what, I think that over every day too, lately, given the nature of things. And also, too, I wanted to get your feedback on the privatization of social assets like the schools and the charter schools and magnets and stuff like that.
Let's start down at this end. I already said my piece.
Revolution at its core is reforming a broken system, taking the U.S. political and governmental economic system and saying, why don't we replace this with something that's not, it wasn't come up with by 100 of, why don't we replace this with something that a bunch of wealthy slave owners didn't come up with 250 years ago? Why don't we build a system that serves all people instead of just the rich and the money? So it's about taking lessons that we've learned from the past 250 years of this system, of other systems, and seeing, okay, this is what people have done, at least this is a social perspective, saying this is what people have done that gave great results in these other places. Why don't we try and take some lessons from them and build something similar like use the same techniques to build something better for people in the United States.
So we live this like peculiar moment in human history, right? Where the majority of people who live on this earth and they cannot access the basic elements of nature. We need to live without working for someone else. We work all of our lives and generally end up with nothing at our deaths. And working harder does not make us any wealthier, but it does enrich our employers. And workers in this country are working harder now than they have ever before. Kim Moody, like a production socialist, actually says within an 8-hour shift, managers have figured out how to get employees to work 2 hours more a day than 2 decades ago. So 2 hours more of labor in an 8-hour day. And in this like weird, peculiar moment in history, almost everything we use in our society is produced by the people around the world. Production's carried out socially and on the largest social scale ever witnessed by the planet. And yet that means of production, the way in which we subsist, it's owned by individuals, right? And every year that production involves more people and becomes more globally interconnected, and at the same time, the number of people who own that whole operation shrinks. A recent study actually found that a few thousand companies control 80% of worldwide production. 80% of the economy worldwide, just a few thousand companies. And this arrangement doesn't pop out spontaneously. It's not some fundamental expression of human nature. It came into being maybe a few hundred years ago, and it can only be maintained, reproduced, and regulated with the state apparatus we currently have right now with police, militaries, prisons, courts. And revolution is the idea that we can fundamentally change society by having a new social order, one in which those means of production are owned socially. We produce socially, we should own it socially. And that there are these democratic, the democratic power of the people that work for these social goods have the control to say how they produce, what they produce, and what they do with their surplus. Because working people around the world would not choose to make nuclear bombs with their surplus. Working people around the world wouldn't make 3 nuclear submarines a year that do no social good whatsoever. They patrol the oceans in case we decide to end life on this planet. And that's it. That's all they do. Working people would decide to not pollute their communities. They wouldn't have built a massive infrastructure for fossil fuels. They wouldn't have built the biggest prison industrial complex this world has ever seen. And then call ourselves the freest nation on the planet. So revolution is the idea that people working together and owning the means by which we produce our lives come together socially and control those means, and not private individual ownership. Now we get there through protests in the streets, coming together, solidarity being our slogan, and understanding the intersectionality of the oppression we all face. However, violence isn't going to come from us. It's going to come from those few wealthy people that do not want the status quo changed. I mean, we invaded Cuba after it had a socialist revolution. We invaded Iran, Nicaragua, Grenada. 13 capitalist countries invaded Russia after the Russian Revolution. And the violence wasn't coming from the working people that started those revolutions. The violence was coming from capitalism, because capitalism is violent by nature. Oppression is violence. And if we don't do something about it, we're going to really impact the ability for life to exist on this planet. I mean, we're at the 3rd mass extinction event. We're admitting we have changed the nitrogen cycle more so than it has been changed in the last 2.5 billion years. Now, if we don't come together and organize a system in which our waste is part of our production and where we can have some sort of unity and a production that isn't based on fossil fuels, this world doesn't have a good chance for human life. So we have a choice before our hands. We can pick socialism and the social production of our goods and the social ownership of that production, or we can end up in Mad Max. And those are our choices.
If I could, this is actually really what.
I was going to.
Oh, go right ahead. Go ahead.
Well said, Frank. The revolution, well, revolution to me by definition, succinctly, is people gathering together to change the existing paradigm. And, there are a lot of ways to do that, and sometimes the way you do that is dictated by the circumstances. I have had a commitment to nonviolence for a long time, but it's being sorely tested. We live in an oligarchy right now. There are a lot of things that, if we don't change them, they will end up being suicidal. I mean, this mass extinction we are in is caused by us.
Yes.
To quote Pogo, we have seen the enemy and it is us. The enemy is us. We got to stop being our own enemy. I had a lot of other thoughts, but I get a little bit derailed a lot of the time. The challenges that we face are going to take cooperation, because our greatest strength as a species is our capacity to cooperate. And when we as human beings cooperate, the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. Now, I see the ideas on the right. My strengths as far as a Senate campaign are a really good understanding of macroeconomics and federal finance and international relations. We have neoliberal economists who are almost all political conservatives saying that, we've got to cut the budget, we've got to cut the deficit, and they're clueless. The year we had the largest deficit, by the best way to define the size of the deficit, was in 1942. The deficit in 1942 was the largest in percent of gross domestic product of any deficit we had. Now, we've got these people running around saying that, we've got to cut the deficit, it's going to, it's going to end up being a crippling debt on some future generation. Excuse me? The most common form of so-called borrowing on the part of the federal government is the 30-year Treasury bond. So let's think 1942, that largest deficit ever. And then 1943 was pretty healthy deficit too. So was 44, 45, and even 46 the year after the war ended. Let's take that 30-year Treasury bond, and that brings us to 1972. That's the year I graduated high school. If this debt is going to crush a future generation, why wasn't my generation crushed by it in 1973, 4, 5, 6? Because that's not the way it works. That huge number that people call the national debt is in no way, shape, or form a debt. There's nobody to pay it back to. In fact, if it were possible to pay it down, the money supply would be zero, because that's what that number represents. We pay that to zero, we have no dollars in our pockets, no dollars in our bank accounts, no dollars in our IOAs. There is nothing in the way of an account denominated in United States dollars that is anything other than zero if that national debt is paid off. But this shows us where the opportunity lies. Every time the federal government has run a surplus, it has been followed almost immediately by a depression or a recession. Those deficits are economic stimulus. That means more money is being put in our pocket. But let's look at what the deficit is being spent for this year. It's making defense contractors $700 billion. It's the tax cut that's 90% of which is going to enrich people who have 99% of the wealth already. We need to take charge of that economics and see that economic stimulus is not only put into things that are economically productive. As Fred pointed out, a submarine doesn't add anything to the economy. But a new machine tool at a place where, machinists are underemployed, that's 3 shifts a week that people are employed. That actually makes something. And if one of those machinists is really creative, they may come up with a new widget that'll send a wave through the entire economy. We need to do things like that with the economic stimulus. We need to do things that are beneficial to we, the people, instead of them, the oligarchs. And that's the revolution I'm part of. That's what I fight for. And that's when I'm going to be on the that's the revolution where I'm going to be on the barricades next to this guy and people like us.
Do you have another one, Peter? Go ahead. I was going to say, I really came to this event today in part because of that theme of, what is revolution? And it's something that a lot of us here, about 9 out of 10 people in the room talk about on Facebook all the time. And 2 quotes.
What else are you going to talk about?
Exactly. Fart book. It's just great, But,
I call it farce book.
Farce book, even better. Well, 2 quotes come to mind. The first is a fake quote, and Adam called me out on one fake quote I had up a while back where I misquoted something, and I thank you because I went and got it right. But I will admit this fake quote. It's a fake Benjamin Franklin quote, because it's not from the actual Benjamin Franklin, it's from the musical 1776, where Franklin, the character, says, revolution is always legal in the first person, such as our revolution. It is only in the third person, their revolution, that it becomes illegal. Gets a big laugh line. But this is a quote that Adam put on Facebook a while back, and I screenshotted it because it related to a conversation that we had at a Green Party event at Fresh, where I was trying to explain that part of what I see as revolutionary activity in what I believe is a pre-revolutionary time, because we are all sitting here in a public library debating ballot access. We're not talking about what building we're taking over. We're not talking about how we're feeding the people or arming the people after a collapse of an economy. This is not an actual revolutionary time. It's a pre-revolutionary time. Because
I am intent on taking over the building of the United States Senate.
Well, I'm all for it, but in the interim, what I believe by a pre-revolutionary time is we can see the environmental clock running. We see the economics, where 82% of all new wealth is going to the top 1%, and 70% of the American people don't have $1,000. Optimum unemployment, sure, but it's menial unemployment, working harder, for less, the money goes fewer places. We know all that. So ultimately, revolution, where the people come together and withhold the labor from the oligarchs, is the only way it's going to change, but that is not coming anytime soon. So in this time, it is how do we advocate for what we know is the ultimate result? To get people who are hardwired Americans from here to there. And I thought about Franklin's quote, and I thought about this quote that Adam put out, and I just wanted to share it. To Americanize Marxism signifies to root it in American soil, to verify it against the events of American history, to elaborate by its methods the problems of American economy and politics, to assimilate the world revolutionary experience from the standpoint of the tasks of the American Revolution. Another line or two, and quote, Leon Trotsky. Now, what I see in that is what I've been trying to advocate, which is where I think the left makes a mistake, and the purpose of this discussion today among different leftists was how do we move forward? We make a mistake by inherently not Americanizing our message. That if you want to talk about socialism, try to show how socialism has roots in Thomas Paine, and in even some of the writings of slaveholders like Jefferson and others, where you can say this idea, this socialist revolution, these reforms that we want, are not coming from an enemy. They are a natural extension of the American Revolution. And that's what I think Trotsky was trying to get at. Because if you get into Americans' hardwiring and you remind them, this country was formed in a revolution, and when our Constitution failed to work, we had new internal revolutions like the Civil War and the women's movement and the labor movement that created constitutional change and brought the thing forward. If you can make your revolution seem like our revolution, seem like an American revolution, you're going to have success. if all people see when they go to socialist websites is Soviet era imagery, here's our hammer and sickle on our sign. If you're of that ilk, you go, yeah, all right. But the average American goes, you're the enemy. And I'm not even listening to word one of what you're saying from day one. If you come in with an American flag and say, do you know that the history of the American Revolution is fill in the blank with leftist statements from your hand-picked founding fathers, and embed this into our American hardwiring, then I think when the actual collapse comes, which we know it's coming, and there will be a revolution, maybe more people will see the leftist revolution as a natural progression, because right now the alt-right has stolen the flag and all the patriotic emblems and phraseologies, and when the revolution comes, my worry is we'll just be the first people they kill. And, so I think what I wanted to say to everyone here who's active, not really looking for an answer or response, but is wherever we can find to embed leftist thought into what is commonly understood in the American framework, in American vernacular, using quotes and using we the people kind of language, and even using imagery like the American flag, God forbid, that create a leftist ownership of the country, that we will have a better opportunity to swing more people to the cause, and that when the collapse comes, because it's coming, that it could go in that direction and not in the fascist crackdown direction, which, if it happened tomorrow, that's exactly where I think...
The stage is being set for that.
Right.
It's fascist.
Right.
It is. It is being set.
So how do we get in there too, where people don't see us as just the radical leftist who wants to instill the Soviet Union in American soil, and instead see the leftist movement as the liberation of the American people, the true, genuine fulfillment of the ideals of the American Revolution?
I think a good place to start would be, what are the ideals of the American Revolution? And the American Revolution was started by a bunch of wealthy landowners who didn't want to pay taxes. And I don't think that's the ideal that we should be promoting with a 21st century revolution. I don't think the ideal of manifest destiny, of kill all the natives so that we can bring white settlers in, is necessarily the ideal that we should be promoting. I think that part of Americanizing revolution involves recognizing the uniquely American crimes of the United States and not downplaying that, but rather addressing it and making reparations for it. An Americanized revolution would have self-determination for native nations, would have reparations for descendants of slaves, would have economic justice for everyone and not just wealthy landowners.
I agree with you 100%. Absolutely. That's the end game. How do we get from here to our goal is a way that we have to, I'm not, this is not criticism, but I'm really thinking we gotta rethink how we have done things. We really have to be outside of the box, and a willingness to give up the way we have done things and we're allied with, and things that are very important to us on the left. Because we need the folks that voted for Trump because they're poor. They need clean water. They need health care. They need all this stuff. And they were desperate to vote for them. And let's not demonize the Trump voters, because they truly are people too. And I gotta tell you, I have relatives in mining country, and I know the arguments that they're giving me, and it made sense to them. So if we can make it sense to them, we will succeed. But we gotta we gotta change our language. We really do.
Yes. There are lots of poor people who didn't vote for Trump who deal with issues with landlords, trouble with getting clean water. Look at Flint, Michigan.
Yes.
Or New Haven, or Hartford, or New London, or Waterbury.
Bridgeport.
Bridgeport, exactly. Cities.
And we have to look at things like, the housing vouchers, the school vouchers. Everybody thinks housing vouchers are great. No, they're not. They're not. They were not intended to truly help people. They were intended to help people get rich.
Did you know that in the past few years, all the new housing that's going up, close to 90% of it is luxury housing?
Yeah.
Like, what we need is affordable housing in
Amen.
New Haven.
But you know, the federal government will say you got to use the cheapest material possible when you build subsidized housing. That is a fact. And what happens is that these contractors know what they're doing. Supposed luxury housing, 60 Mansfield Avenue, that is not luxury housing. I've been in there. I've known people. They've got problems. It's brand new. Shelves are falling down. It's cheaply built. They use poor materials. People sign 18-month lease and they're like, I want out. I can't believe I signed an 18-month lease. And they had to go down $200 a month in the rent. They're paying, I think, $1,025 plus all these fees for efficiency. Well, I'm not going to normalize that amount of rent. That's called you're taking advantage and you're making rents go up and up and up. There's a lot of factors that contribute to that. And, that's the kind of thing that we really need to take a look at. I'm not saying that the system is perfect. I'm not. Believe me, not. But there's a lot of things that we need to really, really educate ourselves in terms of what are the intended consequences, what are the unintended consequences. And people who make money, they know how to twist everything. So we need to take that and empower ourselves.
Well, you touched on school vouchers, and I'm well connected with a lot of educators. And education in this country is a very good example of a pattern that has been used over and over again.
Absolutely.
They sabotaged public education at the federal level and then said, look, it's failing, and then used that as an excuse to open up the huge revenue stream that supports public education in this country
Do the same thing with
to
housing.
private, for-profit operators. And even the not-for-profit operators are actually for-profit because they have a CEO who takes, a third or a half of a million a year, and that's and that means that the books balance, but he's walking away rich.
I'm a proud product of the Harvard Public School System, and the Harvard Public School System was still halfway decent. But they decimated our public school system.
Go ahead.
Just to bring it back to the question at hand, the revolution thing real quick. That's okay. So, I joined the Marine Corps when I was 17 years old, and I wrapped myself in the flag. And I believed we were going to bring democracy to the Arab world. I was going to go get rid of a brutal dictator, and I was going to bring freedom and democracy to the Iraqi people. And that sham was very evident very quickly. So I have no desire to replace right-wing patriotism with left-wing patriotism. The war in Vietnam ended because young men and women who were on the ground in Vietnam knew they had more in common with the northern rice farmers that were shooting at them than they did with anybody who decided they should be there killing each other. Excuse me. So by no imagination do I want to make. I don't want to bring that baggage with us. You know what I mean? The American Revolution baggage. Again, a bunch of rich people convinced young men and women to fight and die so they could get wealthier. And that is something that needs to be fought. And I understand where you're coming from completely, that we need people that wrap themselves in the flag to come to our side, but they will come to our side understanding that patriotism is not a thing that's valuable. It's not a thing that's internationalism is what's valuable. The working people of America have more in common with the working people of China or Iraq or Brazil than they do with anybody who decides anything.
I don't mean to jump. I completely agree with you, and I agree with what you said as well. But if you're the average American who's had this programmed into their head from kindergarten,
Yes.
you've got to get inside there and get them from where they're at to where you want them to be, to think internationally. And most of them think nationally. And what you're saying about like the list of crimes of the United States, it's a long friggin' list. I mean, we've done quite a job of our imperial selves. But if the average American hears you lead off with, you need to see the crimes of your own nation, it's an approach that I'm just saying gets people to immediately react in a rebuffing and negative way, as opposed to saying, you know what, all are created equal may have been a total myth, and government of the people, by the people, for the people, it was never reality. Well, why don't we make it reality?
But think about this.
Doesn't that help bring people in from their frame of thinking than to say you should identify with the person in North Vietnam? Because while some people do and did, and it was effective, most people did not. And that reactionary response can crush any positive forward movement just as easily as the forward. No, I mean, I know this is controversial. I'm deliberately provoking people's thought. But,
But in terms of your sense of Americanizing the left, for lack of a better term, I don't think, I mean, it's not the best term, but let's go with that, okay? The reality is that in many parts of the world, people have looked to their history, and they have not said, oh, for centuries the government was on my side and now it's not. They've actually had the experience of saying, for centuries I was a victim of my government. I was a victim of this system. If you're if you're a peasant in Latin America, you look at the history of centuries of colonial and post-colonial oppression. You don't say, oh yeah, that dictator that we had 100 years ago, he was really cool, and we definitely want to use him as an example of what we're going to be about going forward. And the reason I point this out is that America does have a history that we should be looking at. Absolutely. I think that although I think it's a kind of a flash in the pan, I do think that the folks who decided they were going to organize John Brown gun clubs, I think they've got it right. I think they essentially have got it right, at least in the sense of saying, look, there are two currents in American history. And one is the current that created and sustains the ruling class, and the other is the current that has consistently opposed it. And that means the history of indigenous people in the United States. It also means actually I think I was really happy to see, although I don't agree with him on everything, that Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent book about the 8 years of Reconstruction. Like, how many Americans, as we want to define them, which is mostly really to say, like, white people who are in, like, working class, or middle class people, how many Americans are aware of the fact that there was a period of time in the United States when black people ran the southern states? Not ran from the southern states, not were forced out of them, not were lynched in them, but actually ran the governments in those states. And that it was the American ruling class, that it was the good Northerners, the good Northerners who ran the insurance industry and ran the textile industry, who said, you know what? Those black people are getting too much power. Let's end martial law, and let's unleash the Klan and allow it to terrorize them and put them back in their place. And they did that at the same time that in the North and in other parts of the country, they were using the courts, which is also something that might be good to keep in mind. They were using our court system right up to and including the Supreme Court to get injunctions against the labor movement, to make sure that unions couldn't organize and people couldn't go on strike.
Absolutely.
So I'm completely down with the idea of Americanizing. I think it's a question of what is American history, because I really believe that I think that what Maya was saying, it has to be a starting point. There has to be a recognition. I mean, actually, as a matter of fact, we're going to look a little bit closer at the American Revolution. Here's a great example. This is something that would be a repeating pattern, actually, over American history. That shortly after the American Revolution, there were rebellions in various parts of the United States, including Daniel Shea, right? Who were basically saying, look, where's what we were supposed to get out of the revolution? We incurred all these debts. We weren't paid for the goods that the government took, that the new government took away from us. Meanwhile, there are merchants in New York who mostly sided with the British, and they're getting freaking rich off the new republic. Those rebellions are the places that we should look to. The same thing with Reconstruction, the bonus army march after World War I and the beginning of the Great Depression. We have to look at those mass movements and say, those are what it means to be an American from our point of view. What it means to be a working class American today, those are the places that we look.
The power of
I want to hear some voices.
Yeah, there are a couple people who have been dying to ask questions who haven't had a chance. And you, and then after that.
I just want to say that's the key thing I think you just touched on. With every single country that tries to make social change, or I feel like, so if you believe in like Marxism, you believe that when there's capitalism, there's resistance to it and struggle. That means that insofar as it's existed, there has always been struggle. And people talk about this a lot with education about slavery. The minute someone was enslaved, the first person who was enslaved started the first slave resistance. And the whole time slavery existed, there were tons of slave rebellions, hundreds and thousands, which just aren't taught in schools. There were hundreds of thousands of workers' strikes and workers' movements. And even in Connecticut, there's a great blog by a comrade in Connecticut called the Shoe Leather History. And it's a huge chronicle of struggles that happened right here in Connecticut. And the way that you make something Americanized, or like, I think the term should be localized, right? Because every country and movement can make their movement localized, is by looking to the history of struggle that led up to the moment that brought us all here. Because we're not the first people that saw that things are wrong. We're a long history of people, and we're part of a world historic movement. And we have to tap into that. And I mean, and I'm a product of an education system that was kind of shaped by people of like the 60s and stuff. Because when I learned American history, my teacher had us read Howard Zinn in every single chapter. And that is like a preeminent chronicle of the history of the United States told from the perspective of the people who were struggling against the United States. And we look to their movements, they never use the United States imagery. The Black Panthers use their own imagery. The gay rights movement makes a gay rights flag. They don't use the American flag. And I think to look to that, to try to localize our struggle in our history, create new movements and new symbols when people become alienated to the American symbols like they should be, like that's how you bring forth struggle. Like you localize it and then internationalize it. You don't patriotizing it would be to have accepted a history of America that we all know is wrong.
Yeah, and one quick thing as well is that people learn through struggle. That's how the education happens. It doesn't necessarily happen in the classroom. It doesn't necessarily happen when we're in a group of a lot of like-minded individuals. The education happens during the struggle, on the picket line, in the mass movement. People start to see that their oppression is linked. Just like when the drum auto work strikes happened, and United Auto Workers kind of got it, you know what I mean, started to get it, even though the factories there were drawn up very much on racial lines. It's through struggle that we'll understand. People will come to understand that America was never great, and that the fights that we need to have are intersectional, interconnected, and don't need the baggage of the American flag.
I just want to add to that one of the best teachers is failure. So when we hit the struggle and we trip, we learn from that and we pick up and go. Show me someone who's never failed in your life, and I'll show you someone who has no clue.
I just wanted to say, like you talked about reaching out to people who are, as you said, wrapped in the American flag, and I'm not saying to isolate those people or not talk to them, but I'm saying that like American history has been a history of struggle, we should look for the people who are currently struggling, the people who are oppressed, the people who are getting a raw deal from the system, and those should be the people we reach out to because they're already not happy with the system, and it's not going to be as much work to convince them, hey, maybe a new system is better.
Well, I respect your points. It's just this is my 28th year.
You've spoken quite a bit. Can we have some other voices here, please?
Oh, I didn't know there was another hand up. I'm sorry.
It was like a stack.
Oh, sorry.
You were next in the stack, actually.
I was basically going to say what Maya was going to say. So I'm a PSL member, and I volunteered at one point for Peter Lindsay and Daddy Osorio's campaign, which was our presidential campaign. And Maya can speak to this a little bit more because I know you have a lot to say about that. But I think a lot of the time we go into this work with this preconceived notion that's taught to us that working class people are not smart, that working class people don't know what their problems are, don't know the source of their problems, and are just so easily duped and brainwashed. And that is really not the case. And it really, like, one of the most powerful things about that presidential campaign, even though we were absolutely not going to win, was, speaking to people on the street from various walks of life, including people who identified as Republicans, including people who identified as, like, anti-socialist, using very blatant socialist imagery and saying, we're running for president, do you want to know what socialism really is? And the second, you have a program with socialist points, the second you share something like that, it resonates with people regardless of what they've been taught in the past. So I think we need to not underestimate our class. I think we need to not underestimate the people that we're working with. And I think what Maya said, what we're seeing right now that's very, very important and particularly indicative of the power of our movements is we're seeing leadership from the most oppressed people. We're seeing Black leadership, brown leadership, indigenous leadership, young leadership, trans leadership, queer leadership. That is what we need to be seeing and centering in our movements. And that is what is going to give us that extra revolutionary push because, like Maya said, those are the people that are most oppressed and those are the people that are most incentivized to fight for a new system. And I have a lot of optimism towards how well and how fast people can learn just based on their own experience in their own lives as working people, regardless of what they've been taught. So that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Comments? If not, Adam and then Elena.
So, I appreciate you kicking off this conversation by quoting me, quoting Trotsky. But I also, yeah, that's a nice ego boost. But I made a point not too long ago of noting the 100th anniversary of the Palmer raids in the United States, where members of my union, the IWW, were in every state, in every major city, in every state. Every police department drew up a list of names. They went to the union halls illegally with no warrants, kicked the door down, listed everybody's names and address, went to their houses, locked them up, tortured them, beat them, starved them, threw away the key, and then released them with no charges. Those who survived the beating and starving and so on.
Deported a few thousand.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Emma Goldman among them, most famously. So when you cite American history and American imagery, going all the way back to Joe Hill and Bill Haywood and Frank Little, members of my union have always understood that the right wing is always going to do that. That's what they do. That's what fascism is, if you read Mussolini, is the suppression of class struggle or the negation of class struggle with a thin veneer of nationalism wrapped in the flag. That's what it is. That's what it's always been. So we don't win as working class people, as workers who work for a living. We don't win by wrapping our movements in our national flag. That's just wrong. From members of my union, from Frank Little, who was murdered for engaging in organizing against World War I. He was dragged out in the middle of the night and lynched. Moving from him all the way forward to now, 113 years later, certainly in the IWW, I'm sure everyone on the left understands, you don't win by wrapping yourself in the national flag. They're already going to do that. You have to explain to workers why they have the same interests in common. And they do, all across the world. Everyone who works for a living has the same interests in common, regardless of what flag you happen to be born under and what patch of dirt you live on.
I also think wrapping the flag, or wrapping yourself in the flag, or burning the flag, are two ideological expressions of something that comes first. And what comes first is the facts that you know about your country. So when we talk about history, we really need to get history right. And I get the impulse to not start with the crimes, but that's why you start with the positive side of the struggle. Like, there was this big parade with big, beautiful songs about something, and then they got the horrible repression, right? But you tell the story of the wonderful parades, of all the unions, of all the songs, and then you build up that sense of the, and then you go to the hard facts of, they did that, and isn't that nice? But they all died, and then eventually you'll have someone maybe burning the flag or making a new flag. But yeah, wrapping yourself in it is because you have one set of facts that we all believe are wrong, and then being angry at the flag is understanding a whole new set of facts which we believe are more correct.
I want to respond.
Did you signal that you wanted to respond?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
Peter. Peter, then Jen.
Yeah, just actually not so much to respond to that, but actually to add an important point to what Adam was saying. I mean, I think your point about I think marking the Palmer raids it's a really incredibly important period of American history. But let me castigate you for having left out one very important fact, which is relevant to this discussion, which is this: that when the FBI broke into these union halls, now it's true they didn't have warrants, right? But we do have this thing called rule of law. Even it may be bourgeois, but it is the rule of law, right? So when they went into the union halls, what was the crime for which they were able to arrest people and detain them?
Probably too many people in public space.
No. Not displaying the American flag in your union hall.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they arrested people for, and that was the basis. Ultimately, that was the excuse they had to collect the information that ultimately led to thousands and thousands of unionists being jailed or beaten or deported.
Would that happen today?
Yep, absolutely. it would.
If there's no flag being displayed?
Absolutely.
I would wager. I can't say I'm certain. I'd wager that the Connecticut statutes include a provision that a public assembly of more than a certain size that has to have an American flag present. I can't say I know that for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if it were the case. And I can tell you for sure that even if that weren't the case for the state of Connecticut, that there are plenty of towns in the state of Connecticut, towns and cities in the state of Connecticut, where there certainly is something like that on the books.
I want to respond to some of the comments about history. I've heard you go back to the turn of the 19th century, and from the 19th to the 20th, and I really think we need to go farther back than that. I learned about the Pullman strike in the 19th century, and there used to be a website up, I think it's still up, called Hope Out Loud, and they had a link to a timeline. And it's about when and where U.S. troops were engaged in combat areas. U.S. combat troops were engaged in combat areas, combat zones, dating back, I think, to 1810 or 12. You can hardly find 2 years in a row where the United States has not had combat military personnel in a combat zone since 1810. Even in the middle of the Civil War, there was a United States Navy flotilla with a contingent of Marines in a combat zone in China. Our history shows us to be the most bellicose nation on the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the histories we have to overcome. And in large measure, it has been more to our detriment than our benefit. And you talk about, engaging people who wrap themselves in the flag. Here's an issue that I've watched in my lifetime. Because one of the things I think is a big reason why our voices have been shut out is something that's called the Reagan Revolution. The conservative elements who took credit for what they called a landslide victory for Reagan and Republicans in Congress decided, we've got the right idea. We don't have to listen to those liberals in the Republican Party, because the Republican Party at that time had a very vibrant, dynamic, liberal wing. And those people's voices were shut out. Then they shut out the moderates. They called them rhinos, Republican in name only. And now, since the end of the Reagan revolution, the Reagan administration, these people have been living in an echo chamber where they listen to nothing but their own voices, and they have gone off the deep end. These people are out of touch with reality to the point where they are a danger to themselves and others. They are a danger to us. Now, when it comes to reaching out to people, I want to listen to conservative voices. There is such a thing as a sane conservative. I've met more than one. And I don't want us to end up in a similar echo chamber, listening to our own voices and going off the deep end on the other end side of the pool.
Precisely.
We need to listen to the conservatives. Conservatives start from a different point of view than we do. That means, if I'm here and the conservatives here, half of what they see, I don't see, half of what I see, they don't see. And that's a good enough reason to cooperate with them. They also process information differently. Well, I know I'm not perfect. I know I'm not God. We used to have a very conservative young lady in the Green Party, and whenever she disagreed with me, the first thing I wanted to know was, what were your thought processes on that? Because that way I could find out if she picked on something I missed. So, as much as I am a leftist, some people call me an absolute radical, I do not want to shut out conservative voices because, we have 4 pillars in the Green Party. Grassroots democracy. I've known a lot of conservatives who support that notion 100%. Environmental sanity, which is something we desperately need in this time. I know, most of those conservatives I know who agree with grassroots democracy believe in, are supportive of economic sanity. Social justice.
Not so much.
Not so much. But some of them, see the need for that. And peace. We're all better off with peace. And I think I saw Owen's hand up there. So I'm going to turn it over to Owen.
Sure. Wow, I've got like 20 minutes of responses to everybody.
5 minutes to do it.
5 minutes. I'll try and make it like 1.5 minutes if I can. 2 minutes.
See me after class.
But yeah, I mean, it started going back about 30 minutes ago when Peter was talking about making things local and taking local action and getting involved in the state legislature and electing people, getting people involved. And basically, I mean, and part of the conversation was around, how bad the climate change is, the world's about to end. People are realizing how bad things are. It's not just extreme climate change that endangers us, it's extreme feudalism throughout the world. And so this is a ripe time. And I come from both an anarchist background and a Democrat background, and I'm long out of the Democrats now. It seems like a long time, but it was just about 2 years ago that I finally gave up on them. Yeah. But and I don't disparage PSL, and I like PSL, and I like a revolutionary socialist approach. So I wouldn't say to Daryl that we shouldn't mention, we shouldn't have the hammer and sickle or things like that. I think there's a place for some groups to have that. I don't think that's going to be the mass movement that happens at this time. But I think it's important to have people who have that ideology and express it, and people are aware of it. So I applaud you, and I like working with PSL, and I think you do a lot of great work. And I think we should. This is, I think, where we should work together is important. But I have been canvassing for Bernie out in Indiana and in Illinois, and I think I was at the Left Forum back in June, and Paul Street, who writes for Black Agenda Report, was speaking with Glenn Ford and John Mubarak and others, and I asked some questions about where we go from here. And one thing that Paul Street said is those flyover zones, and I know it because I spent many years there, but those flyover zones, we should not be shaming them, and we should not be ignoring them, and they are a good source of our support for a mass movement. And so that's where I think we have to, it doesn't mean that we can't do this or we can't do that, but part of this movement, and I think you were speaking to this, Daryl, is meeting people where they are. Mm-hmm. And part of that is local action, like you were saying, Peter. So local action in New Haven may be, getting out there with, I have a nice Che flag I just got, getting out there with the Che flag and organizing people. But that's not going to translate when you're in Evansville, Indiana. And part of organizing in Evansville, Indiana is getting out there and going door to door and talking about what's oppressing people there. And I think you have to meet people where they are to a certain extent. It doesn't mean we wrap ourselves in the freaking American flag and say, rah, rah. And at some point we do have to confront our American atrocities that we've done. But I don't think you lead with that. I just don't think you lead with that. And I would say, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say a few other things. Local run, running for office in coalition, I think the Greens can help. There's other avenues as well. Greens can help. I'm with the Green Party now, but it's good that we are able to run candidates like yourself, Peter. I think other groups should look to work with Greens or to work with whoever can help get at ballot access. This is just one part of it, and if you don't believe, and I don't thoroughly believe that electoral politics are going to be the solution, but it does help to get the message out there. I think you should coalesce with. We should all coalesce with. I signed up to be an organizer for Movement for the People's Party, only because maybe that'll work, and I know it's a lot of people trying to bring people out of the Democratic Party into our movement. So I may work with them as well. But at the state legislative level, I think we do need to have people there, or it's even okay to work with, and I know I don't like working with Democrats. I don't think the Democratic Party or the Republican Party is going to change. But how do we get into the legislature? How do we get involved? I know we can advocate, we can try and affect change, but I think there are folks in there. And Baird Welch Collins, running in Waterford, who was a Green, who's going to run as a Green, who's running as a Democrat. I don't like the idea. I'm glad he's running as a Green because, that just makes me feel better. I wish he was running as a socialist or a liberation anarchist or whatever. But you got to meet the system where it is now. And I think working with Baird, working with other people, maybe Josh Elliott, maybe Chris Soto, maybe some of our group knows Norm Needleman, and we're running against Jason Adler. If we can push them with our collective strength, I think we could possibly get some of them on board to help us to get through the state legislature. But I'm sorry, non-electoral things are important too, and I think feet on the ground and doing things includes economic and social organizing, cooperatives, and so there's a thing called Cooperation Jackson. If you don't know it, look it up because this is a great example of what you can do without electoral. Well, it involves some electoral politics, but what you can do on the ground for a people's movement. Now it's in the capital of Mississippi, Jackson. So it's a minority city, and there's a lot of possibility there. That's different than maybe in the suburbs of Connecticut. But also consider, cooperatives. Richard Wolff's Democracy at Work is trying to help people organize cooperatives around the country. And then I would just finally say that, there is a possibility for mass movement. There was the Bernie movement, there's Dem Exit. Where those people go is important, or that they find something. And it doesn't have to be PSL, it doesn't have to be the Green Party, it doesn't have to be the Socialist Party, but we've got to make a united front for them to realize that this movement can continue outside the Democratic Party.
Well, we have to go until 3:15, so I wanted, and it's 4 minutes till 3. So I wanted to ask, are there follow-up events that are going to happen, because it seems like we just scratched the surface?
Well, I know that we have, Fred and I have had discussions about doing a program like this one in other parts of Connecticut. At the moment, we don't have any, I don't believe we have any actual firm dates. But we do know that we've talked about New Haven, folks from PSL have talked about helping us get a space in New Haven, Hartford, Stamford, right? Stamford, somewhere before the end of the, before the election, before election day.
What about campuses?
We can get spaces at UConn, the Stores campus, so that's a definite possibility as well.
And also working with somebody from Wesley who's expressed interest as well.
Oh, fantastic.
Just because I brought it all up and caused some stir the pot, I just wanted to clarify for everyone as well that I fully support everybody in this room and sign the petition and agree with everything that everyone said. But I remember 28 years ago going to a forum at URI in 1990 that was about left politics, and I had just read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. My father, who's a professor, gave it to me and went to this forum. and heard pretty much exactly the same thing that I heard today. Exactly the same approach, with exactly the same crowd of about exactly the same size, and over that same 28-year period, we have seen the greatest concentration of corporate wealth and even greater expansion of militarism. So I raised some of the alternative thoughts that I raised, not to be sabotaging and not to anger anyone about bringing up, patriotic sentiments. It's just the idea that we have to find a way to grow beyond this 1%, or it's not going to be an effective movement. And when I look at some of these mass protest movements in the United States history, they usually did use, in many cases, either patriotic imagery or religious. The cross of gold, the crown of thorns, brothers and sisters came from equal brothers and sisters under Christ. And it was whatever language you had to use to reach your audience. And I think we've got to reach a bigger audience, because I do think this is an extinction level event we're in. And if we don't do something, there aren't going to be human beings here in 100 years. And that's why I was in the Green Party for 2 years. And that's why I raised these concerns. So I just want everyone to know that I'm not poking people and saying whatever. I agree with you. I just don't want to be 28 years down the road and it's still the same 10 people sitting in the room saying we're going to wake people up by showing them all these horrible things.
What I hear you addressing is the strategy of the sales pitch, for lack of a better term.
That's exactly it.
And I agree with you 100% in principle. We're not doing a good job of selling. We're not doing a good job of convincing. And one of the reasons we're not is because we're not engaging in a con job. See, this is one of the reasons the right has succeeded so well. They are perfectly willing to pull the con job.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not. I'm not a good enough liar, and I don't want to be. I want to speak truth to power. And
I would just add to that, part of that strategy of speaking truth to power is going door to door and saying it to every single person. Yeah. And so, to quote Benjamin Franklin, Daryl, don't leave. I was going to quote Benjamin Franklin. He also said, "Well done is better than well said." We need to stop talking to ourselves and go out there and talk to everyone.